So this is probably the case that if you didn't know any Supreme Court cases, you knew this one. Um, uh, and so we're going to cover this case in some depth, but I also want to set the stage much more broader with regards to the strategy that NAACP approaches this case. Um, so it isn't as though segregation was confined solely to Topeka, Kansas. So we have to ask the obvious questions. Um, why was Brown chosen for this case? Why did this case take place in Topeka, Kansas? Why were all these things chosen? Because the NAACP could have gone into any state, in any local district, and found a single individual who would have standing to bring this suit. They were individuals who had standing to bring the suit were simply everywhere. So why was this particularized case chosen? Well, it had a factual setup that was really hard to get away from. Um, the little girl in this case uh, lived within distance of seeing the white school she couldn't attend. It was the equivalent of being across the street. But she was still required to traverse a significant path to get to the black-only school. Um, why choose Topeka, Kansas? Well, Kansas, as you remember back from the beginning of this class, has a significant history in terms of race relations. One, it's not in the South. First off, that's kind of like the important one. They wanted to make sure that they didn't choose a case from the South just because. But Kansas, because of the Kansas and Nebraska act, because of the histories of events like Bleeding Kansas, um, it choosing a case from this region made a lot of sense to the NAACP. And third, the reason why they chose this family in particular is because the attorneys for the NAACP were smart. They chose a young, adorable African-American girl to be the face of attacking segregated school systems. They did that absolutely strategically. All parts of this case were chosen strategically um, because they knew that they needed as many things on their side as possible. This wasn't going to be as easy as demonstrating that an African-American medical school that was never going to be inherently equal to a whites-only medical school. That case is much easier to prove. This case is going to be much harder to prove, and so they wanted to really stack the system in their favor. Um, it was kind of, in terms of history, it was very obvious that the writing was on the wall for those who supported segregated school systems. They could look around, they could see what happened in higher education, and they could see that it was crumbling around them. But the argument was going to have to hinge solely on these ideas of intangibles. Whereas in the previous cases in higher education, they were able to argue that certain tangibles, like certain quantifiable things, were easily demonstrable different. They also let heavily on the intangibilized idea. This argument was going to be exclusively about intangibles because that's really what they needed to do in order to demonstrate that the system was inherently unequal. So in terms of the factual background really doesn't matter. Brown was an African-American child in a segregated school system. It happens to be in Topeka, Kansas. That's the factual background. It was a similar story that was playing out across the nation in many places beyond the South. And so the issue of the case is very simple. Does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other tangible factors may be equal, deprive the children of the minority groups of equal educational opportunities? So I should probably state that again, even though I'm recording this. Does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other tangible factors may be equal, deprive the children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities. And the Supreme Court, in a majority opinion written by new Chief Justice Earl Warren, um, with no concurring opinions, with no dissents, a 9-0 court says resoundingly, yes, that separate but equal school systems, segregated school systems, denies children of the minority group equal educational opportunities than whites, just by the nature of segregation, even if every factor of that education is tangibly equal to education in the white school system. Warren argues that even if the systems were in fact equal in every way, which is an absolute question, whether they were equal in every systematic way, but even if they were equal, if they are separate, that's never going to be true equality. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, and therefore it's an equal protection violation. It violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Separation of anyone, but particularly children, solely on the basis of their race, generates feelings of inferiority, and that feeling of inferiority is mandated by law. So the nature of this separation creates a stigma upon African Americans that whites can very easily see, but also that these children can identify themselves. The Supreme Court, really for the first time sort of citing modern research and social science research, finds that these adverse psychological effects are significant, especially among African American children, especially when they're young, that the psychological effects of this segregation it is damning. And so as a result, any language in Plessy, contrary to this notion, is rejected. But Plessy is not overruled. Important, they do not overrule Plessy versus Ferguson in this case. They distinguish education, public education, from the confines of Plessy versus Ferguson. So Plessy versus Ferguson, after this case has been ruled, is still good law, except in public education. Warren writes, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has absolutely no place. So very much the majority decision in this case looks and sounds a lot like Justice Harlan's dissent in Plessy 60 years earlier. They decide that there's no reason to use original intent for this decision because the individuals defending the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, argued that you have to approach questions like this with with a view of original intent. So in essence, what the founders would want. The court feels so motivated as to reply to that. So Warren says that, well, we're not going to use original intent for two reasons. First of all, there was almost no public education in the 1860s when the 14th Amendment was enacted. Public education wasn't really a widespread phenomena in the 1860s. And therefore, looking at the original intent of the drafters of the 14th Amendment proves monumentally inconclusive because it isn't clear what their intent would be for this institution that didn't exist when the 14th Amendment was drafted. But more importantly, you can't turn back the clock to the 1860s to get the result that you want. Harlan warns about that in Plessy. We can't simply turn back the clock because we want a particularized outcome. And that's what original intent does in some cases. And this would be a very easy case to interpret through the lens of what the drafters meant in 1860 and come to the conclusion that based on 1860 standards, we should still have a segregated school system. But you're living almost in the 1960s, 100 years after those founders that you are that you were asking to interpret their original intent, it seems absurd that in 100 years you wouldn't change the extent by which you interpret these things. Um, Warren goes on to say, we must consider public education in the light of its full development and in its present place in American life throughout the nation. Um, Only in this way can it be determined if segregation in public schools deprives those children of the equal protection of the laws. So we can't look back to the 1860s for our outcome. We have to look at now and the effects of now. And because of that, they absolutely reject original intent, and look at the grounding of what this means. So for them, separate but equal is inherently unequal because there are intangible psychological effects that go on because of a segregated school system. And those psychological effects are magnified because of the age at which individuals are segregated. And because of that, you're creating a dual caste system of which one class of people is, upon the age of 5 or 6, classified as less than another class of people. And even if the education they're provided is functionally the same, that government enforced, societally accepted segregation creates a system that is inherently unequal, but also will have effects that extend far on into the future. And so for that reason, they strike down these segregated school systems as a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, distinguishing Brown v. Board of Education from Plessy versus Ferguson, but they still don't formally overrule Plessy in this case.